It's 2018, and we're in Madison, Wisconsin, and we're here to honor one of the great pioneers in the industry, Ron Eustice. Ron, quite an honor, isn't it?
It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm honored and humbled.
Well, every pioneer has a story, and your story is quite colorful and very long, too, as well. Started out in Minnesota, didn't it?
Well, I was raised on a dairy farm in southern Minnesota, near the town of Waseca, and we had a small dairy herd, mostly Great Holsteins. We had a few Ayrshire cattle, but actually my first dairy animal was a brown Swiss calf that my parents purchased with a war bond that my great-grandfather had given to me to further my education. Well, my parents decided that they needed the money worse than I needed the war bond, so they cashed the war bond in, and from that time on I was the owner of a brown Swiss heifer.
And later on you went on to the University of Minnesota.
I did. I received a scholarship, $400 scholarship from the Steele County, Minnesota Bankers Association, and that kind of encouraged me to go to the university. I was the first one in my family to seek a college education, and with that $400, which is $200 per year, I was able to pay a good share of my tuition at the University of Minnesota. So I proceeded to go 4 years and obtained a degree at the University of Minnesota, but in the meantime, during the summers, I worked for various show herds in Minnesota, as well as the Meredith Farm in Massachusetts and the EOB Apache Ranch in Lapeer, Michigan. And that opportunity really opened up doors both nationally and internationally.
Well, you obviously had a lot of contacts early on, and then you started a career working for a publishing company.
My first job out of college, I had a couple of job offers. One was with the Holstein Association to be a field man in Ohio, and the other one was with Successful Farming Magazine, Meredith Corporation in Des Moines, Iowa. And early on, during one of my summers, actually in Michigan, a man named Joe Eves, who actually was one of the founders of the Dairy Shrine, found me, and he came to visit the herd in Michigan, and he said, "Where are you from?" And I mentioned that I was at the University of Minnesota, and he said, "What are you studying?" And I says, "Agricultural journalism." He says, "When do you graduate?" Well, I says, "Not for a couple of years," because I was basically a sophomore at that time. And from that time on, Successful Farming was in contact with me, and they weren't going to let me go. So when I got out of the university, when I graduated, I worked for Successful Farming for a couple of years and enjoyed it, but my love of cattle won over. And I wrote a letter to Carnation Milk Farms, and I received a response back from Linus Hall, and he says, "You know, I think there's a place for you." He says, "But you're going to have to go to Los Angeles and talk to those people because they're hiring." And that opened up a real opportunity because I was offered a position in Mexico with Carnation of Mexico, where I basically managed their genetic programs down there, and involved importation of semen and also training, AI classes. And of course I had learned, I studied Spanish in high school and in college, and so I was mostly fluent in Spanish at that time, and I taught AI classes for 2 years in Mexico and taught hundreds of farmers and ranchers to breed cattle. And we had a very successful program, and I look back on those days with Carnation very fondly.
Well, you were so successful in Mexico, they brought you up right up to the headquarters, didn't they?
Well, it was a period of transition for Carnation at that time, and there were a lot of things happening in the AI industry. And they brought me back as actually international marketing, and I became assistant general manager, and eventually I was the general manager. And it was an interesting period. There was these were basically in the 70s, and there was a lot of changes going on in the AI industry, but I remained with Carnation for 7 years, and then Uh, uh, I had met Dr. Bob Walton 50 years ago now, and when I was showing a red and white Holstein here at this very World Dairy Exposition. And that red and white Holstein was the reserve champion at the first National Red and White Show. And Bob Walton was in his business suit, newly appointed the president of American Breeders' Service. And he was at ringside. And all of a sudden he started following me as I was leading my champion cow out of the ring. And he came up to me, he says, excuse me, he says, I want to introduce myself. He says, do you know your cow is sired by an ABS bull? And I says, absolutely, she's sired by an ABS bull. And her mother was also by an ABS bull. And that got Bob Walton real excited. And just recently, I've been working with Bob Walton on his autobiography. And now I know why he was excited, because he had only recently become president of American Breeders' Service. And he was trying to create a bit of a new image for ABS, because ABS at that time was known as a source of high milk production. But they did not have a reputation for outstanding type. And he was trying to turn that around so that you could use ABS bulls and you could get not only high milking cows, but you could get fancy cattle as well. Well, my cow, my red and white Holstein, was probably the first ABS sired animal to win a purple ribbon at a major show. And it was right here in Madison in 1968.
Well, your career at ABS allowed you to travel the world, and so you were an international person, and were in numerous countries, weren't you?
I have traveled and worked in 80 countries of the world. I lived in Mexico 2 years in the 1970s. I lived in Indonesia 3 years. During the late 1980s, I was involved with Land O'Lakes at that time, and actually providing training to new dairy farmers. We had a 12,000 cow dairy farm, and we provided cows to what we call small holders. And each farmer got 6 cows. And my job was to train those farmers how to take care of those 6 cows. And they'd never owned a cow before. And eventually I did all the training in the local Bahasa Indonesia language and became fluent in Indonesian. After 3 years in Indonesia, I came back and I became the executive director of the Minnesota Beef Council, and I remained there 22 years and was until I retired, and was very involved in implementing the first dairy beef quality assurance program in North America.
So that's quite a bit about your career. Obviously, your passion for the dairy breed has now led you into a new career, I guess, as an author.
Yes. Well, I became, at the 50th anniversary of the Red and White Dairy Cattle Association, I was asked to jot down a few words about some of my recollection of some of the early red and white breeders in this country, and I was very involved in the 1960s, at the time that the Red and White Dairy Cattle Association was being founded. I knew all of the original founders of the Red and White Dairy Cattle Association, and so I began to take a few notes and write some articles on some of the early breeders. Pretty soon I had a book, and we published that book called Red and White Reflections at the 50th anniversary of the Red and White Dairy Cattle Association. We were on a tight budget, and they said, we only can have a 85-page book. Well, I says, I've got a lot more than that. Well, they said, you're going to have to write another book. So then I wrote a second book on red and white Holsteins, and that's called They Saw Red, which obviously has a bit of double meaning, because there were some folks that saw red because they didn't want red, and there were other people that saw red as an opportunity. So we highlighted in that, and that's about a 275-page book, and it's available at Amazon, and it's been well received. But since then, as a result of my work with Dr. Larry Spade from Penn State University on the Red and White book, I've become involved with another book, a third book actually, on polled dairy cattle, and it's called Polled Pioneers. It's soon to be released, And it tells the story, the history of naturally hornless dairy cattle in North America.
Well, it's a tremendous career you had, but obviously there are a few people at home, and I know you've got a lovely wife. Tell us a little bit about your family.
I have been married 44 years, and my wife, Margaret McAndrews, grew up on a dairy farm, Holstein Dairy Farm, in Rosemount, Minnesota, actually right on the edge of St. Paul. And we have 2 children. Kevin has a PhD from UCLA in computer engineering, and he is with Google in Seattle. And our daughter, Anne Marie, has her degree at the University of Minnesota in interior design. She also lives in Seattle, and she's with Amazon.
So you are cornering the tech market in your family anyway. So, well, it's my pleasure to be with you, Ron Eustice, a true Dairy Shrine pioneer, and now in the National Dairy Hall of Fame. Congratulations, Ron.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure.